Hello, thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I'm David Pendergrass. I received a really good question the other day. Well, it's a series of questions relating to Jesus before his ministry. He says this: Hey David, I had a couple more questions for you. First, what do you think Jesus' life was like before his ministry began, such as when he was in his early to mid-20s? Was he simply working as a carpenter and laying low, so to speak? Actually, was he even a carpenter, or was it Joseph who was the carpenter? Was he studying the Old Testament documents and talking with the religious leaders of the day to learn more? It's all somewhat speculative since the Bible gives us so little about his early life, except the story in Luke when he was 12 years old and his parents couldn't find him. If anything, I think Luke would have given us the most information, but I'm guessing he felt that Jesus' early life wasn't anything too remarkable, or at least wasn't worth putting in his gospel account. Anyways, I was just curious what your thoughts were on that. That's a really good question. I was fascinated about these questions too for a long time, and still am a little bit. The early church was also fascinated by this, apparently. As you're right, the Gospels say very little about Jesus before his ministry, when he's a child. Only in Luke do we have when he's a baby in Matthew and Luke, but then Luke we have the example of him going to the temple when he's basically a young man, or early about to be a teenager. But besides that, we don't know what's going on. But we do have some likely historical scenarios, and I'll talk about them in just a second. But we have other documents written later on after the Gospels that tell us some things that happened. Now, most New Testament interpreters around the world would say these are not legit, but they're around, and they're probably examples of what some people wish had happened. They kind of fill in the gaps. One such document is called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. In the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, there are all kinds of stories. For example, here's one. This little child Jesus, when he was 5 years old, was playing at a ford of a brook. And he gathered together the waters that flow there into pools, and made them straightway clean, and commanded them by his word alone. So he cleaned out the water just by speaking it. He purified the water. And having made soft clay, he fashioned 12 sparrows. And it was the Sabbath when he did these things, or made them. And there were also many other little children playing with him. Now a certain Jew saw that Jesus did this, playing on the Sabbath, and went and told his father Joseph. And they went and found that he had taken the clay and fashioned 12 birds, and he polluted the Sabbath day. And Joseph showed up and said, "It's not lawful to do this. Why'd you do this on the Sabbath?" But Jesus clapped his hands together and cried out to the sparrows and said to them, "Go!" And the sparrows took their flight and went away chirping. And everyone's amazed. A little bit later on, it says that when he went through the village, a child ran by and hit Jesus on the shoulder. And it ticked Jesus off. It provoked him. And he said, "You won't go all the way. You're not going to make it," bottom line. And the kid immediately fell down and died. And then the parents of the dead child came to Joseph and blamed him, saying, basically, this is your fault. This is your fault. And these kind of stories go on in the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. These kind of things happen. There's a few more examples like this in Apocryphal Acts, what we call the Apocryphal Acts. And if you'd read these stories, you'd see how really different they are from the Gospels themselves. There's a lot more emphasis upon Joseph and Jesus doing all kinds of stuff that don't fit the Gospel's portrayal of Jesus well at all. Now, maybe they really happened, but most people don't think they do because they are so different from Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and also because the earliest texts seem to come quite late. But nevertheless, they have some fairly early texts. So that's the kind of stuff that early church people like to talk about, at least on certain sects or certain groups wrote these kinds of documents. We don't know what happened, but what can we tell from the Gospels themselves that seem to indicate the kind of things that Jesus might have done and what it was like? So to answer your question, some people know this, but to make sure we're clear, Jesus almost certainly came from a very, very small village called Nazareth, or Nazareth. Nazareth of Galilee. And Mark 1:9, it says, "In those days Jesus came from Nazareth, Tis Galileis." So Nazareth of Galilee, and was baptized by John in the Jordan. So he came from Nazareth. In fact, Jesus is called the Nazarene, and he's Jesus of Nazareth. So it's highly historically likely that the appellation of Nazareth was given to Jesus because that's how they distinguish between Jesus and other Jesuses. He's Jesus of Nazareth. That matters because they don't have last names in the ancient world. It's like saying Simon the Zealot. When Jesus is spoken of from other people or about from other people in the gospel narratives, or even from the narrator, he's given an appellation: Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the teacher, or so forth. Inside of the narrative, he might be called Jesus, son of David, son of God, and so forth. So almost certain, I'm convinced he was from a town called Nazareth. Now, the problem is, outside of the Gospels, Nazareth is not mentioned in any documents till about the 4th century. But as far as I understand from archaeology, archaeologists have uncovered a small, you might even say village, real small village, that is near modern-day Nazareth. Modern-day Nazareth has about 75,000 people in it. But in the time period, archaeological excavations have confirmed that the city was a small agricultural village during the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Very, very small. So we should imagine maybe a few hundred people. This is a tiny, tiny town in which Jesus grew. So that's where he's from. We learn also in the Gospels that Jesus was a tekton. I'll explain that more in just a second. In Mark 6:1, it says he came back to his hometown. It really means his father's house, his father's dwelling, and his disciples followed him. So the hometown there mentioned probably means Nazareth. He taught in the synagogue, and the people going, who can do this? Who has this wisdom? Who can do these kind of mighty acts? You might say miracles. And in verse 6:3, it says, the people are asking this question kind of rhetorically. Isn't this the hatekton, the carpenter or handyman? We'll talk about that in a second. The tekton, the son of Mary and brother of James, and it really is Yakobu is where we get the word Jacob. So anyway, that's really what it means. Isn't brother Yaakov, James, or Jacob, and Eosteus, so Iosus, and then Judas, or Judah. Judas was a very, very, very common name in the time period. And Simonas. So don't we know his kinfolk, and aren't his sisters with us? What's strikingly absent in Mark 6 is any mention of a father. Now, if you'll read the Gospels independently, and almost certainly Mark was written first, what's striking is we do not have a birth narrative in Mark's Gospel. We're not told that he was born of a virgin. And it's striking that in Mark's Gospel that omits the virgin story, there's no mention here listing the family of Joseph. Now, that's exactly what a first century Jew would have done. They would have said, isn't this the carpenter, the son of Joseph? In fact, growing up, Jesus probably was called Yeshua ben Yosef, Jesus, son of Joseph. Your kind of last name was taken after your father. And that's not what happens in Mark 6. That's really striking. Matthew and Luke have birth narrative stories that talk about virgin birth, and then they also do not mention Joseph. That makes more sense. But historically speaking, then, it's more likely, to me, and most interpreters, that early on, there is a tradition that Joseph is not around. Now, some people then say he probably wasn't around because Joseph probably died, and that's why he's not mentioned here. And then some little more skeptical scholars would say, and that's why Matthew and Luke invented the virgin story, because early on it was that he didn't have a father, that his father had died. It's always possible. I don't think that's likely for a few reasons, but this isn't about the birth narratives. That may be a different podcast. So we know that here his father's not mentioned. Now, where is Joseph? We don't know. But all we know, by the time this happens, this occurs in his ministry. This is probably around the year AD 30, probably 28, 29, 30. We're not exactly sure. There are a few telltale signs in the Gospels of when things occurred, like during Herod the Great's reign and so forth. But we don't know exactly when it happened. Now, I have a few things to say about that. Let me say that I'll come back to the carpenter issue. One is, we don't know how long Jesus' ministry lasted. You will always hear that his ministry was 3 years or 3.5 years. You'll hear that everywhere. You're going to hear it in commentaries, read it in commentaries. You're going to hear it from preachers and teachers. And it's just unfortunate because this is one of those church legends that won't die. The Gospels never tell us how long his ministry was. The closest hint we get if this is an historically accurate representation, as in John's gospel, where he's at the temple early on, and then later on he visits the temple in his ministry, and then he ends back up at the temple. Well, you can do the math. If you visit the temple 3 times, how many years is that in between? Well, if it's in his ministry, that's only 2 years maximum, right? Because that's how that works with math. So for some reason, people continue to say 3. The fact is, we do not know how long his ministry lasted. We just don't know. We don't know how old he was when he came to John the Baptizer. Many scholars would surmise that Jesus would have been considered an adult, and from other Jewish texts, but some of them are later, it seems to be the case that a Jewish man was considered an adult when the Father said you were. That's usually around the age of 30. So it's not unlikely that Jesus was around 30 years old when this occurred. It's also not unlikely that he was around between the age of 30 and 33 by the time he was crucified. So that's not crazy. That's probably pretty likely. The fact is, but we're not certain. We don't know. He could have been 20 years old and he had a ministry for 10 or 15 years. There's no way to know for sure. So we don't know how long his ministry lasted. We just know it lasted for some time, long enough to have these recorded. What about this business of being a tekton, a carpenter? Is this not the carpenter? That translation is fine. The word teknos is actually it's tekton in the accusative. It's a broader term. It means someone who's involved in construction. It can mean carpenter, builder, craftsman, woodworker, stonemason. It's a broad term for someone who works with their hands. So what resources did Jesus work with? We don't know. We just don't know. We know there's a good bit of wood not too far away, and certainly a lot of stone. And we just don't know what he did with it. So one translation could very well be handyman. He helped around, he built things. He built construction sites, he built houses, he fixed the door, we're not sure. Many scholars surmise that because of that description of being a tekton, a few things. One is almost certainly Joseph was a carpenter, of course, and he probably trained it. That's where you learned your trade. Your dad taught you. Joseph was probably, the same kind of craftsman. He taught Jesus how to do it. But also that's really interesting is that you could work with, wood, stone, horn, or ivory. That's interesting because about 4 miles away from Nazareth was a town called Sepphoris. Now this matters because Sepphoris and a couple other towns were Roman cities being built around the time of Jesus. In fact, about the time Jesus was born, Herod Antipas, he's the son of Herod the Great, he ruled over Galilee. And Herod Antipas is the one who ordered the execution of John the Baptizer. He made Sepphoris his capital. So Sepphoris was the capital for Herod Antipas's rulership around the time of Jesus' birth. So he built a town. He built a city to make it his capital there. So for about 30 years, while Jesus grows up in Nazareth, almost certainly, most scholars would suppose this, I think this is pretty historically probable, that Joseph worked on that construction site in Sepphoris, right up the road. It seems to be very likely that Joseph took baby Jesus and a young man Jesus and then a teenager Jesus and then in his 20s Jesus. I don't know when Joseph probably did die by the time he reached close to 30 years old. That would have been a long lifespan. Joseph would have been in probably his upper 50s, early 60s, and that was a common lifespan of a man. So it is likely that he was dead by the time Jesus had his earthly ministry. All that to say, he probably, before he died, took Jesus and trained him how to do his trade and was a construction site worker, you might say, a handyman in that sense. And there's several things that make it likely. One is because they would have needed people to do the job, and we know that they use local craftspeople to construct cities like that, if at all possible. And we also know that they weren't that far away. I mean, they're just in walking distance. So it's highly likely that many, many mornings they woke up, he and Joseph, and got his tool belt on and walked to Sepphoris and got paid and came back. But we don't know. But almost certainly he visited the site. It's not that far away. Another thing that makes it interesting, or a little more likely, is when you listen to the way Jesus talks. Jesus certainly talks about farming and seeds and how animals work, but he also mentions things like rulers and nobility and construction, and when you build houses and the foundation. how governments work and finance. In other words, he uses city life analogies in his parables. Well, that's interesting because Nazareth was not a city, it's a little village, and I mean, he would have been around cities like Jerusalem and so forth. But it just seems very likely he was in Sepphoris at some point. Then you ask the question, would he have grown up studying the Old Testament and so forth? The answer is almost certainly yes. Jewish boys, males, learn the Bible and got an education, some degree of education, where females typically did not. We know that Jesus had some formal training because he almost certainly read from the Hebrew. In Luke 4, when he's at the synagogue, he reads from Isaiah and says, today it's fulfilled in your hearing. So he does have an education, and also, of course, in Luke, when he's 12 years old, he's in the temple. Father's house, didn't you know how to be my father's house? Father's house just means the temple. That's all it means. It doesn't mean daddy's home kind of thing. Just, I'm at the temple, and he's studying early on. It is not at all historically crazy to think that Jesus had a very strong appetite for learning as much as he could. So what is likely? What is likely is Jesus grew up going to synagogue every single Shabbat, Saturday. Probably there in Nazareth or near at Capharnaum in Capernaum. We know that there's a synagogue in Capharnaum where he preached in Luke 4. Now, the synagogue that's there now was erected around, I think, the 4th century, but beneath it was the original site of where he preached. So he did grow up in the synagogue. He grew up learning his Bible. He would have known the prophets very well. Jesus models most of his ministry after the biblical prophets, particularly Isaiah and Jeremiah. He's very influenced by Daniel, or Daniel, who the Jews consider to be part of the writings, not a prophet, but he certainly thinks he is like the Son of Man figure. So Jesus is certainly well steeped in Old Testament, what we call Old Testament theology and Old Testament scriptures. He would have grown up in that village with a mom and dad, being a carpenter, being on call, growing up near the water. He would almost certainly have met the earliest disciples and apostles. Remember, he's related by cousins by John the Baptizer. James and John and Peter, Andrew, these guys very well could have been playmates of his that he grew up with. It is not unlikely at all that he would have known these different characters. So by the time he has his earthly ministry and calls them, that they are people who are well acquainted with Jesus. What's striking is that they leave their nets right away and follow him, because as we see in texts like in Mark 6, Jesus says a prophet is not without honor except in his own hometown. That is, when they think they know you, they're not going to have faith in you because, oh, we know who you are. They're that boy who used to help around the house. But the fact that people outside of his town are more willing to believe is, I think, historically probable. So he probably does know some of these guys growing up. I'm not sure, but it just seems likely in a small village. And that he grew up being a carpenter's son or a handyman's son and then does the same thing and then grows up close to his brothers and sisters. And I think they are brothers and sisters, not cousins. Roman Catholics don't think he had brothers and sisters. I think they're wrong. I think they actually are siblings. So by the time Jesus grows up and he's in the synagogue and he's preaching, we know this fits other examples from the ancient world of what could have happened. It's not that bizarre that he is, in Luke chapter 4 at least, he all of a sudden is teaching from the synagogue. Synagogues were not run by a pope or they were not run by the temple. They were local autonomous congregations. So it was not uncommon at all to have a local teacher show up that day and start teaching. So what we know is by the time Jesus shows up, probably late 20s, early 30s, he is already respected as someone who really knows his Bible. He already is respected as someone who really knows his Bible. And that's why the number one title given to Jesus in the Gospels is teacher. Teacher. That meant for them someone who explains the Bible well. So there's nothing controversial when he shows up at Capharnaum to teach. He gives the Bible and puts it down. What's so controversial is what he says. Today this has been fulfilled in your hearing. That's what gets him in trouble. That's what people go, who in the world does he think he is? Jesus, just teach the Bible. Come on, do your sermon. But now he says, no, you're looking at the guy. I bring in the year of the Jubilee. The Spirit has come upon me. I remember when this hit me years ago, that perspective, because the perspective that as a real person in Nazareth growing up, helping your dad and so forth, I mean, earthly father, of course, it made a lot more sense to me why people would have been so surprised, shocked, and incredulous. Oftentimes, think about it. Think about it. Think about a person you've known for several years, and they're from a small town, and all of a sudden, they start healing people and saying, I forgive sins, or rather, you are forgiven, and I will usher in the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is here, and those who obey my teaching. The stuff he said about himself, you really had to decide, this guy's gone crazy, or he's telling the truth. And for a first century Jewish audience, the proof is in the pudding, like it is today. They would say, if he really is a prophet, well, then he would do mighty acts. Well, that's what he did. And if he really is a prophet, he could speak authoritative of the text. Well, that's what he did, and so forth. Well, that's all I'll say for now. I wish we knew more. I'm sure you do too. But at the same time, I think to end where you alluded to in your questions, which is, did Luke not think it's important, or the gospel writers not think it's important to add the details? I think it's important for us to remember that the gospel writers almost certainly wanted to emphasize Jesus' ministry. So though I want to know what it was like, what he was like, at the same time I wonder if it would not, hurt me some way. Would I also be like his hometown? If I knew Jesus' favorite fish, would I worshiping these kind of fish, or would I start going, he's just a guy, or I don't know. I wonder. All I know is the gospel writers are not interested in that. They're interested in his ministry and his significance, particularly his death. And other ancient biographies are like that. They do emphasize some of the details of the main protagonist's life, but not a lot. And they don't care that much about chronology. They can move it around here and there. They're mainly interested in what they're interested in telling about the character. And in the Gospels, we see it's primarily about what Jesus taught, how he behaved, and certainly about his death and resurrection. When I meet him face to face, I can't wait to ask him, what were you doing when you were a teenager? God bless you. I'll see you next time. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you want more, go to davidpendergrass.com, davidpendergrass.com. If you look at the top, you'll see various tabs that have sermons I've preached, a link to all the podcasts I've done so far, a link to my consulting website. For more information about my consulting, see davidpendergrassconsulting.com. Also, you'll see information about the books I've written that are found on amazon.com. So davidpendergrass.com, one-stop shop, all that you need. If you want to reach out to me, follow me on Twitter at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass, and send me a message. I'll see you online. I gotta run and tell about what the Lord has done for me.